can't be done," the young welder said, pushing his high-tech auto-darkening helmet up on his forehead. He wiped a smear of sweat and grime from his brow, leaving a dark streak. "This frame is scrap. The heat stress from our first pass just made the microfractures worse. Tell the boss he needs to order a new subframe assembly." He kicked the massive tire of the crippled John Deere 9RX. The sound a dull thud in the cavernous barn. The old man, standing by the doorway, half hidden in shadow, said nothing. He just watched, his gnarled hands resting on the handle of a rusty wheelbarrow. He knew better. He knew the metal. He knew what it needed. But they saw a groundskeeper, not a master craftsman. They saw faded overalls, not a lifetime of experience fused into his very bones. Would they ever listen? Comment? Respect, if you believe the quietest person in the room often knows the most. Arthur Vance was 78 years old, and his body kept a detailed ledger of every one of them. A slight, almost imperceptible limp in his left leg, a souvenir from a dropped steel plate in a Norfolk shipyard 50 years ago. A fine web of scars on his forearms, silvery trails left by incandescent sparks that had found their way past his leather jacket. His knuckles were thick and swollen, the hands of a man who had spent a lifetime gripping tools that vibrated with immense power. Yet those same hands were impossibly steady. When he drank his morning coffee from a chipped ceramic mug, the black liquid was a perfect placid mirror. He worked as a part-time groundskeeper on the McGregor farm, a sprawling agricultural enterprise that was more corporate than country. He mowed the vast lawns around the main house, tended the flower beds, and patched the fences. It was quiet work, and it suited him. He lived in a small converted shed on the property, the rent deducted from his modest wages. The space was sparse: a cot, a hot plate, a small bookshelf with worn paperbacks about naval history, and a single framed photograph on the wall. The photo showed a younger Art, lean and wiry, grinning in front of the colossal gray hull of an aircraft carrier, the USS Forrestal. He rarely spoke of his past. To the farmhands, he was just Art, the old man who kept to himself. But there were tells for those who knew what to look for. The way he stood, never slouching, his shoulders squared as if by decades of habit. The way his eyes, faded blue like a winter sky, would scan the horizon, constantly assessing, measuring. And the most peculiar habit, when he sat on the porch in the evenings, his right index finger would tap silently against his knee in a series of long and short presses, a ghostly conversation in a language almost everyone had forgotten. He was a man who had built and mended things far more complex than a garden fence, things that floated, things that fought, things that carried the lives of thousands of men across the world's oceans. What none of them knew, not the farm owner, not the arrogant young Welders, not a single soul on that property, was that the crippled tractor in the barn presented a problem he had solved before, under 20 fathoms of water, with the groan of a dying ship in his ears. The main barn at McGregor Farms was a temple of modern agriculture. Gleaming stainless steel milk tanks lined one wall, connected by a labyrinth of pipes and computer-controlled valves. A new combine harvester, a machine the size of a small house and costing more than one, sat pristine in the far bay. The air smelled of diesel, hydraulic fluid, and the sweet, earthy scent of alfalfa. But right now the cathedral was silent, save for the anxious energy radiating from the center of the concrete floor. There sat the John Deere 9RX, its massive articulated frame broken. The crack was a jagged, ugly wound in a thick piece of cast steel right at the main pivot joint, the heart of the machine's strength. The farm's owner, Tom McGregor, a man in his late 40s with a business degree and the permanent frown of someone wrestling with commodity futures, paced back and forth. Planting season was a week away. A week. Every day that tractor sat idle was thousands of dollars bleeding away. He had hired the best mobile welding service in the county, two young men named Jake and Cody, who arrived in a brand new truck with more logos than a NASCAR vehicle. Jake, the lead, was all confidence and technical jargon. He talked about beveling angles, root gaps, and pulsed MIG welding with the casual authority of a surgeon. Cody, his apprentice, mirrored his every move, nodding sagely. For 2 days they had ground, heated, and welded, filling the barn with the sharp metallic stink of burning flux and ozone. And for 2 days they had failed. Their welds, shiny and neat on the surface, cooled and cracked. The thick, unforgiving cast iron refused to be tamed, shrugging off their efforts. The initial hairline fracture was now a gaping chasm, surrounded by scorched metal and their own failed, beaded attempts. Tom's patience had evaporated, replaced by a cold, simmering dread. A new frame was 6 weeks out and cost $60,000. He was trapped. 300 miles away, a man in a perfectly pressed naval uniform sat in a quiet office overlooking the Elizabeth River. He picked up his phone, a personal call from his son. He listened for exactly 10 seconds to the frustrated technical complaints. Then he sighed, said he was on his way, and walked out of his office without telling his aide where he was going. He just knew his son needed him. The first time Arthur offered his help, it was so quiet it was almost missed. He had been sweeping the barn floor, his movements slow and methodical, staying well out of the way of the welders. Jake had just thrown his welding gun down in disgust after another attempt failed with a loud ping as the fresh bead split. "The carbon content in this cast is all wrong," Jake announced, as if the tractor were personally insulting him. "It's contaminated. You can't get proper fusion." Arthur paused his sweeping, leaning on the broom. His voice was soft, raspy with disuse. "You need to preheat it slower," he said, not looking at Jake, but at the wounded metal, "and use a nickel rod, not steel wire." Jake turned, his expression a mixture of annoyance and disbelief. He looked Art up and down, taking in the frayed collar, the oil stains, the wrinkles. "What did you say?" Art repeated his suggestion a little louder this time, his gaze still fixed on the frame. "Slow preheat, 400 degrees held for an hour, then a high nickel-shielded arc rod. Lay it in stringers, peen each one with a hammer to relieve the stress as it cools." Jake let out a short, incredulous laugh. Cody snickered behind him. "Hey, Pops, thanks for the advice," Jake said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But I've got about 20 grand worth of pulse welding inverter here and a half dozen certifications on my wall that say I know what I'm doing. This isn't patching a muffler on a lawnmower. This is metallurgy. Why don't you stick to your broom?" He turned his back on Arthur, dismissing him completely. Tom McGregor, too stressed to intervene, just ran a hand through his hair. Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if Jake had confirmed something he already knew. He picked up his broom and resumed sweeping, the rhythmic shoosh-shush of the bristles on the concrete, the only sound in the tense, silent barn. He had seen men like Jake before, on ships and in yards, men whose confidence far outstripped their competence, men who talked a great game but who, when the pressure was truly on, broke just as surely as the metal they were failing to fix. The next morning, Jake and Cody tried again, this time with a bigger, hotter torch for the preheat, a brutish application of force where finesse was needed. They were determined to prove the old man wrong, to conquer the stubborn frame through sheer power. They wrapped it in thermal blankets and blasted it with a propane torch that roared like a jet engine, heating the metal around the crack to a dull cherry red. Arthur watched from the far side of the barn, where he was ostensibly cleaning old harnesses, the smell of leather and saddle soap, a strange counterpoint to the acrid scent of burning propane. He saw them rush the process, saw the impatience in their movements. They were treating the symptom, not the disease. When the metal was hot enough by their estimation, Jake laid into it with his MIG welder. The machine set so high it screamed. For a few glorious moments it seemed to work. A thick molten bead filled the chasm they had ground out. Cody stood by with a fire extinguisher, looking nervous. Jake finished the pass, flipped up his helmet, and grinned, a triumphant, sweaty smirk. See? Just needed more juice. He let it cool for 20 minutes, far too quickly, before he and Cody eagerly chipped away the slag. The result was a disaster. The new weld hadn't just cracked, it had pulled a whole new section of the parent metal with it. The fissure was now twice as long, a spider web of new fractures radiating out from their botched repair. The frame groaned, and the whole front end of the tractor sagged another half-inch, a visible, sickening slump. Tom McGregor let out a strangled gasp. It was worse. It was significantly, catastrophically worse. Jake's arrogance evaporated, replaced by a pale, clammy fear. "It's the casting," he stammered, backing away. "It must have been defective from the factory." He was already building his excuse, distancing himself from the mangled steel. The other farmhands who had gathered to watch began to murmur among themselves. A few shot sympathetic glances towards Arthur, who was now just standing still, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He wasn't looking at the failed weld. He was looking at Tom McGregor, whose face was the color of ash. The confident young welder thought this was the end of the conversation. He was wrong. This was the beginning of the worst day of his career. That evening, long after the humiliated welders had packed up their gleaming equipment and sped away, Arthur sat in his small, quiet room. The air was cool, smelling of cut grass and the distant scent of rain. He didn't turn on the main overhead light, preferring the small pool of yellow cast by a single lamp on his workbench. On the bench sat his lunchbox. It was an old thermos model, steel, the green paint worn away at the edges and on the dome, revealing the silver metal beneath. Scratches and a few small dents told the story of its long life. He clicked the latches, the sound sharp and precise in the silence. He opened the lid. There was no food inside. Instead, it was lined with worn, oil-stained felt, compartmentalized with small wooden dividers he had made himself. It was a toolbox. In one compartment, nestled in soft cloth, was a chipping hammer, its head mushroomed slightly from countless impacts, its wooden handle worn smooth and dark with the oil and sweat of his own hand. In another lay a pair of welding goggles, the old-fashioned kind, with circular green lenses, simple and functional, and in the main compartment, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, were his welding rods. They weren't the common 6,011 or 7,018 rods you could buy at any hardware store. These were different. Some were thick and coated in a heavy dark gray flux. Others were slender, almost delicate. He picked one up, a rod designated for high-nickel alloy work on cast iron. He had maybe 20 of them left. They hadn't made this specific type in over 30 years. He had carried them with him from ship to ship and then from job to job in his civilian life, a secret arsenal for impossible tasks. He ran a thumb over the cool, rough texture of the flux coating. The rod felt familiar, comfortable. It was an extension of his will. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he wasn't in the quiet shed. He was deep in the hull of a destroyer, the ship pitching violently in a North Atlantic storm. The lights were out, save for the emergency battle lanterns casting long, dancing shadows. The air was thick with the taste of salt and fear. A critical steam pipe had fractured, and he was the only one who could get to it, the only one who could weld it while it was still under pressure. The memory was as clear as yesterday. The hiss of the steam, the roar of the arc, the absolute unwavering focus required to lay a perfect bead while the world tried to tear itself apart around him. He opened his eyes. The memory wasn't a nightmare, it was a reminder. The tractor frame in the barn was just a piece of metal. It held no malice. It was simply broken, and he knew how to fix it. The next day dawned gray and damp, the sky threatening a rain that never quite came. Tom McGregor stood in the barn, staring at the tractor as if it were a beached whale. He had been on the phone all morning. A new frame was indeed $60,000 plus shipping, plus another $10,000 for installation. It would take 2 months to arrive. 2 months. The season would be over. The farm might be over. He was scrolling through his contacts, about to call a salvage yard as a last resort, when Arthur walked up behind him. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his presence quiet but solid. Tom finally looked up from his phone, his eyes red-rimmed with stress and lack of sleep. "What is it, Art?" he asked, his voice flat and defeated. Arthur nodded towards the tractor. "I can fix it." Tom let out a bitter laugh. "Art, no offense, but the experts with the $100,000 rig just about broke it in half. What makes you think you can?" Arthur's gaze didn't waver. "Because they don't understand the metal. They were fighting it. You have to persuade it." The words hung in the air, simple and strange. "Persuade it." It sounded like something a horse whisperer would say, not a mechanic. Tom was about to dismiss him again, to just walk away, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the utter lack of arrogance in the old man's voice. Maybe it was the quiet confidence in his eyes. Or maybe it was just the sheer, bottomless desperation of his own situation. He had nothing left to lose. "Fine," Tom said, the word coming out as a sigh of surrender. "Try. Go ahead. You honestly can't make it any worse." A flicker of a smile touched Arthur's lips, gone as quickly as it came. He just nodded. "I'll need a few things. A heavy-duty extension cord, and nobody bothering me." As Arthur walked towards his shed to retrieve his lunchbox, Jake and Cody's truck, against all odds, pulled back into the driveway. They had been sent back by their boss to document the damage for insurance, a final, humiliating task. They saw Arthur emerge from his shed with the ancient metal lunchbox and walk purposefully towards the tractor. Jake scoffed, a renewed spark of his old arrogance returning. He was about to make another cutting remark to mock the old man one last time. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that the tremor they had all mistaken for an old man's frailty wasn't from age at all. It was the barely contained energy of a master preparing for his work, a familiar thrumming he hadn't felt in years, the same feeling that had earned him a Navy Commendation Medal, a copy of which was folded neatly inside the lid of that very lunchbox. A black Lincoln Navigator, gleaming even under the overcast sky, crunched up the gravel drive and parked near the main house. The man who stepped out was in his late 60s, but he moved with the ramrod posture and economic grace of a career military officer. He wore civilian clothes, a crisp polo shirt and pressed khakis, but he couldn't hide the aura of command that clung to him like a uniform. This was Captain Miles McGregor, USN, retired, Tom's father. He was here to see his son, to offer what little moral support he could after their brief, frantic phone call. He was a man accustomed to order, to systems, to problems that could be solved with decisive action. The chaos of farming, the weather, the markets, the sheer unpredictability of it all, had always baffled him. He walked towards the barn, drawn by the low, rhythmic tap, tap, tap sound coming from within. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, the distinctive, deliberate chipping of slag from a fresh weld. As he entered the wide doorway, his eyes took a moment to adjust to the gloom. He saw the scene, his son, Tom, standing with his arms crossed, his expression a cocktail of hope and anxiety. The two young welders from the day before stood off to the side, smirking, their arms also crossed, in a posture of mocking disbelief. And in the center of it all, kneeling before the massive broken tractor, was an old man in faded overalls. He had a small, ancient-looking welding machine plugged into an extension cord. He wasn't wearing a fancy helmet, just a simple handheld shield that he held up with one hand. In the other, he held a welding stinger from which a thin curl of smoke still rose. He was meticulously cleaning the bead he had just laid, his movements precise and unhurried. The captain paused, his curiosity piqued. He was no stranger to repair work. He had overseen dozens of refits and emergency repairs in his 30 years of service. He recognized the quiet focus of a true professional, and it stood in stark contrast to the dismissive posture of the two young men by the wall. He took another step inside, his eyes narrowing slightly, trying to get a better look at the old man's work. Jake couldn't help himself. The sight of the old man with his primitive-looking equipment was just too much. He nudged Cody, a smirk playing on his lips. "Get a load of this," he muttered, just loud enough for Tom to hear. "Grandpa's gonna fix a $60,000 casting with a rig he bought at a yard sale in 1972. He then spoke louder, his voice echoing slightly in the big barn, aimed directly at Arthur. "Hey, old-timer, you gonna preheat that with a candle? What kind of rod you using there? A sparkler left over from the 4th of July? Arthur didn't respond. He didn't even look up. It was as if Jake didn't exist. His entire world had shrunk to the few square inches of metal in front of him. He had spent the last hour painstakingly grinding out every last trace of the young welder's failed attempts, creating a clean, perfect V-groove in the cast iron. He had used a small propane torch, not the roaring monster Jake had used, to gently, evenly bring the surrounding metal up to temperature, checking it with a practiced hand, feeling the warmth radiate through the thick steel. He was communing with the metal, listening to it. Now he carefully selected another nickel rod from his open lunchbox. He clamped it into the stinger, lowered his simple face shield, and paused for a beat. Absolute stillness. In that moment of silence, Captain McGregor took another step closer. He wasn't looking at the equipment anymore. He was looking at the man. He saw the posture, the economy of motion, the way he held the stinger not like a tool, but like a surgeon's scalpel. It was a posture of deep, ingrained competence, of a man who had done this exact thing 10,000 times before. He had seen men stand like that on the flight decks of carriers during typhoons, in the engine rooms of frigates with alarms screaming. It was the stance of someone who knew, with absolute certainty, that he was the only thing standing between order and chaos. The two young welders thought this was a joke. The farmer thought it was a desperate last-ditch prayer. But what none of them knew, not Tom, not Jake, not Cody, was that in exactly 30 seconds a retired Navy captain was about to witness a master class in a dying art, and the entire world inside that barn was going to turn upside down. Arthur touched the tip of the rod to the metal. A brilliant, white-hot arc erupted, flooding the dim barn with an intense, almost violet light. But it was the sound that made Captain McGregor freeze, his blood turning to ice water. It wasn't the angry, crackling hiss of the MIG welder Jake had used. This was different. It was a deep, steady, rhythmic roar, a smooth, consistent burn like the sound of ripping canvas. It was the unmistakable sound of a shielded metal arc weld being laid by a master. Psst. The sound of pure fusion. The captain moved closer, his breath held tight in his chest. He watched, mesmerized, as Arthur began to move the stinger. He wasn't just filling the gap. He was weaving, creating a perfect, tightly stacked series of overlapping circles. The molten puddle of steel followed his command perfectly, a liquid sun under his complete control. He was laying a vertical up bead, one of the most difficult welding techniques, especially on thick, unforgiving cast iron. He made it look as easy as writing his name. The bead he left behind was flawless. It looked like a stack of dimes, each ripple perfectly uniform, perfectly spaced, fused deeply into the parent metal on both sides. It was more than a repair. It was a work of art. Jake and Cody had stopped smirking. They stared, their mouths slightly agape. They had never seen anything like it. Their machines, with all their computer chips and digital readouts, could never produce a weld that clean, that perfect. They were looking at a level of skill they didn't know existed. The captain, however, wasn't just seeing a good weld. He was seeing a signature. The specific angle of the weave, the consistency, the speed. It was as familiar to him as his own reflection. A memory dormant for decades surfaced with the force of a rogue wave. A fire, a crippled ship, a young welder, his face blackened with smoke, laying a bead just like that one on a glowing hot bulkhead, stopping a chain reaction that would have torn the ship in two. He looked away from the weld and focused on the welder. He saw the gnarled hands, the steady grip. He saw the faded denim of the overalls, and then he saw it, a small faded tattoo on the man's right forearm, partially visible below his rolled-up sleeve. It was a fouled anchor crossed with a lightning bolt and a welder's torch, the insignia of a Navy hull maintenance technician. The pass was complete. Arthur finished the bead, broke the arc with a flick of his wrist, and lifted his shield. The silence in the barn was absolute, broken only by the faint ticking and groaning of the cooling metal. He reached for his chipping hammer, preparing to clean the slag, but a voice cut through the quiet, a voice of pure authority. "That technique," Captain McGregor said, his voice low and resonant, the stacked weave on a vertical up. There was only one man I ever saw who could run a bead on compromised high-tensile steel like that, in the middle of a force 10 gale, no less. Arthur looked up, his eyes meeting the captain's. He saw the recognition in the older man's face, the dawning, impossible truth. He gave a slow, tired nod. The captain took a step forward, his eyes locked on Arthur's. "What's your name, sailor?" he asked. The last word an unconscious slip, a return to a language they both understood. Arthur slowly got to his feet, his knees cracking in protest. "Vance," he said, his voice still raspy. "Arthur Vance." The captain's face, already serious, went pale. The name hit him like a physical blow. He stared at Arthur, his mind racing back through the years, through the ships, through the faces of the thousands of men who had served under his command. Vance. Arthur Vance. "Chief Petty Officer Vance?" he whispered, the question full of awe. "From the Forrestal? After the flight deck fire in '67? He didn't wait for an answer. He turned to his son, Tom, his voice suddenly a thunderclap that shook the entire barn. "Tom, do you have any idea who this is? Do you have any idea what this man has done?" Tom, Jake, and Cody all flinched as if he'd fired a gun. They stared, confused, first at the furious captain, then at the quiet old groundskeeper, who now seemed to be standing a little taller, his shoulders a little squarer. Far away in the National Archives, a single piece of paper sat in a dusty file. It was a commendation letter signed by a young Captain McGregor, recommending a certain hull technician first class for a medal, citing extraordinary skill and courage under fire, preventing the catastrophic loss of the vessel. The man who wrote that letter now stood face to face with the man who had earned it, and the full weight of that forgotten history was about to come crashing down on everyone in that barn. "This man," Captain McGregor began, his voice ringing with a righteous fury that had been honed by decades of command, "is Chief Petty Officer Arthur Vance. And the reason I know his weld is because I bet my life and the lives of 3,000 other men on it 40 years ago." He pointed a trembling finger at Arthur, but he was looking at Jake and Cody, his eyes blazing. "We had a fire in the number 2 engine room. A fuel line ruptured. It melted a damn bulkhead, and the only thing on the other side of that bulkhead was an auxiliary magazine. The ship's damage control teams couldn't get close. It was too hot. They were about to seal the compartment and flood it, which would have crippled the ship. But this man, then a kid not much older than you two, volunteered. He put on an asbestos suit, crawled into a space no bigger than a coffin, with metal around him glowing red, and he welded that bulkhead shut. He laid a bead just like the one you're looking at now, while the sea tried to break us in half and the ship threatened to explode." He turned to his son. "When we got back to port, the engineers from the shipyard said it was impossible. They said a weld made under those conditions shouldn't have held for 5 minutes, let alone 5 days. They called it a 1-in-a-million weld, but it wasn't 1 in a million. It was a Vance weld." He looked back at Arthur, his anger softening into profound, bottomless respect. He didn't just fix engines and patch holes. He was what we called a hull surgeon. They flew him from ship to ship in the fleet. When something was too broken, too difficult, when the engineers gave up, they sent for Chief Vance. He worked on nuclear submarines, on battleship gun turrets, on carrier catapult systems. He didn't just use tools. He spoke a language that metal understood. Jake and Cody stood frozen, their faces drained of all color. The smirks were gone, replaced by gaping expressions of shock and shame. The certifications on their wall, the expensive equipment in their truck, it was all meaningless, childish posturing in the face of this living history. They hadn't just insulted a groundskeeper. They had mocked a legend. Tom McGregor stared at the quiet man who mowed his lawn, trying to reconcile the image of the humble laborer with the titan his father was describing. The old man, Art, just stood there, his hands in his pockets, looking slightly embarrassed by the attention, as if he were being praised for simply doing his job. The vindication was silent and absolute. There were no more sarcastic remarks, no more challenges. The only sound in the barn was the captain's heavy breathing and the continued gentle tink of the cooling weld. Arthur, seemingly unfazed by the dramatic revelation, went back to his work. He laid 2 more passes, each one as perfect as the first, building up the repair until it was thicker and more substantial than the original casting. He then laid a final cosmetic cap pass over the top, a weld so smooth and uniform it looked like it had been done by a machine. When he was finished, he spent 20 minutes with a grinder and a sanding disc, smoothing and blending the repair until it seamlessly merged with the surrounding frame. When he stepped back, it was impossible to tell there had ever been a crack. The metal was whole again, a thick, powerful scar that was now the strongest part of the entire machine. He began to pack his tools, carefully wiping each one with a clean rag, before placing it back in its felt-lined compartment in his old lunchbox. He moved with the same quiet deliberation he had shown all along. Tom McGregor finally found his voice. He stepped forward, his face a mess of conflicting emotions, shame, gratitude, awe. "Art, I'm so sorry," he stammered. "I had no idea. How much do I owe you?" Arthur clicked the latches on his lunchbox shut. He looked at Tom, his faded blue eyes clear and direct. "You owe me for the rods. Call it $20. $20? Tom said, incredulous. "Art, you just saved my farm. You saved me $60,000. "Job's done," Arthur said simply. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a statement of fact. He picked up his lunchbox and started to walk away. Captain McGregor intercepted him, putting a firm, gentle hand on his shoulder. The 2 old men looked at each other. No words were needed. It was a look that spanned decades, bridging the gap between a captain on his bridge and a chief in his engine room. It was a look of shared hardship, of mutual, unspoken respect. The captain gave a short, sharp nod. Arthur nodded back. Then, in the middle of the barn, surrounded by the stunned onlookers, Captain Miles McGregor, who had shaken hands with admirals and senators, brought his heels together and raised his hand in a crisp, perfect salute. Arthur Vance, the groundskeeper, simply straightened his shoulders and returned it. In the immediate aftermath, a heavy, awkward silence filled the barn. Jake and Cody seemed to shrink into themselves, unable to look anyone in the eye. They quietly loaded the last of their gear into their truck, their movements clumsy and uncertain. Jake, who had been so full of bravado, couldn't even bring himself to look at the flawless repair on the tractor. It was a testament to his failure and a monument to a skill he would never possess. He and Cody drove away without another word, and no one on the farm ever saw them again. Tom McGregor stood for a long time, just staring at the weld. He ran his hand over it, feeling the smooth, powerful bead. He felt a profound sense of shame, not just for his own dismissiveness, but for the casual, everyday way the world overlooked men like Arthur. The quiet, the elderly, the unassuming, they were treated like ghosts, their pasts and their immense capabilities rendered invisible by age and humble circumstances. He walked over to Arthur's small shed later that afternoon with a bottle of expensive whiskey and 2 glasses. He found Arthur on his small porch, cleaning a lawnmower blade. They sat together as the sun went down, and for the first time Tom didn't talk about crop prices or equipment failures. He just asked questions. And for the first time Arthur answered. He didn't talk about heroism or danger, but about the work. He spoke of the unique challenges of welding titanium in a submarine's hull, of the feel of different metals, of the satisfaction of making something broken whole again. It was a quiet, profound education, a lesson in a life of purpose that Tom, for all his business success, deeply envied. The next morning, the farm owner thought he finally understood the old man. He was wrong. The depth of what he had witnessed was only just beginning to sink in, and it would change not just how he saw one man, but how he saw the world. A week later, the John Deere 9RX was back in the fields, its powerful engine roaring as it pulled a massive planter, turning the dark earth and sowing the seeds for the new season. It ran better than it had in years, the repaired frame holding firm against the immense torque and stress. Tom McGregor had tried to give Arthur a bonus, a check for $10,000. Arthur had politely refused, simply leaving the envelope on Tom's desk. "I'm a groundskeeper," he'd said. "Pay me for the grounds." But Tom found another way to show his respect. He had a small brass plaque professionally engraved. He cleaned a spot on the tractor's frame right next to the perfect weld and riveted the plaque in place. It read, "Structural Repair by CPO Arthur Vance, USN, IEET." Every person who ever drove that tractor would now know its story. The culture on the farm shifted. The way the other hands spoke to Arthur changed. They used to call him Art. Now, most of them called him Mr. Vance, or even Chief. They brought him a coffee in the mornings. They made sure he had the best cut of meat at the farm barbecues. They treated him not with pity or condescension, but with a quiet, abiding reverence. They saw him now. They saw the lifetime of skill etched into his hands. They saw the unwavering integrity in his posture. Tom's father, the captain, extended his visit. He and Arthur spent most evenings on the shed porch, two old sailors in the middle of an Iowa cornfield, speaking a language of acronyms and ship names that no one else understood. They were rebuilding a connection forged in the crucible of a crisis decades ago, finding solace in a shared history that the world had long since forgotten. Arthur Vance was still the groundskeeper. He still mowed the lawns and patched the fences, but he was no longer invisible. His work, both past and present, was finally seen. True strength is often quiet. It doesn't reside in the loudest voice or the newest equipment, but in the steady hands of experience. It's found in the humility of a master who has nothing to prove because his life's work speaks for itself. Men like Arthur Vance walk among us every day, their incredible pasts hidden beneath the simple clothes of a quiet life. They are the builders, the fixers, the guardians of a knowledge that can't be learned from a book or a screen. All they ask is to be seen not for what they appear to be, but for the sum of their deeds. The lingering image is a simple one. Arthur Vance, sitting on his small porch at dusk, a cup of coffee in his steady hands. In the distance, the lights of the great tractor move across the fields, a powerful machine made whole again. He watches it work, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his face, content in a job well done. Heroes are all around us, often in plain sight. We just have to be willing to look past the surface and see the honor that lies within. For more stories that celebrate these hidden legends, subscribe to our channel and join a community dedicated to giving respect where it is truly due.